The Cincinnati Bengals franchise tag T. Higgins back in February, and now with July 15th and the franchise tag deadline passing, no long term deal will be struck. And let's take a retrospective on the Bengals offseason on the whole.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Bliscoe. He's your host, James Rapine. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals, covering your team every day. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcast, and we appreciate all of you out there who make us your first listen. And shout out to the everydayers, the Locked On Bengals regulars, the Locked On Bengals insiders who are part of the Locked On Bengals Insider subscription program at joinsubtext.com/Locked On Bengals. And that will certainly be ramping up more with training camp right around the corner. And before we get to our training camp previews and get back to all of the storylines that James and I will be watching and discussing and analyzing throughout training camp, the offseason is roughly coming to a close with the franchise deadline passing. Technically, there is still a little bit of time before training camp officially kicks off the preseason portion of our programming for 2024, with veterans reporting and rookies reporting next week for the Bengals. But as a franchise deadline for a long-term extension for T. Higgins is passing shortly, as expected, it has been reported that T. Higgins will not get a long-term deal done with the Cincinnati Bengals.
No deal not coming. And we knew this. I'll even go as far as to say T knew this months and months ago. I mean, 4 months ago. But there was always, I think a little hope, at least, not always, but going into the offseason. And then the receiver market just exploded, Jake, to another level. And I think it made it so where there would never be, even if there was a 1% chance in March that they find common ground, that they would never find common ground this offseason. And that's why I think T's been prepared to play on the tag for months. It's part of why at least he signed it last month, signed the franchise tender. And that not only surprised us, I think that surprised people in the building. And so the good news is I think he has the right mindset going into this season. At the same time, it sucks because it feels like a breakup is inevitable. And we've seen this with Jesse Bates is I think the most reasonable comp, because he's drafted, former second rounder, developed into one of the best safeties in the league. And with T, it's like receivers, everyone thinks receivers grow on trees, but T does not. A 6'4", 215-pound guy that runs like he doesn't, he's hard to find. And so it stinks because this is, in all likelihood, his last year in Cincinnati.
Can't rule out entirely that there will be a second franchise tag placed on T. Higgins. I know that's not something that T. Higgins or his agent would like to hear, but I don't think that at this point we can rule that out entirely. Ian Rappaport's tweet about this, because you have to at least, I guess, report on it when it happens, even though the report is very, very brief and something that people who have been following this news for a long time have seen for a long time coming. Everyone listening to the show, like you said, James, has known that this was coming for a very long time, even though I think there were, to talk about holding out hope, I think there were some Bengals fans even holding out slim hopes that maybe something was happening behind the scenes, despite every indication that these sides had not come together to negotiate for quite some time. But in Rappaport's tweet, he even said he's going to play out the year on the franchise tag and be one of the biggest free agents next year. And my initial thought when I saw that was like, not so fast, my friend. He may be one of the biggest free agents to hit the market next year. But as we've discussed on this show, I think there is still the chance. And even if it's not a likely outcome, I don't think it's a dismissible outcome that T. Higgins gets the second consecutive franchise tag.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's certainly a path to that. Heck, there's a path to where it works out. But I was thinking about this because in a perfect world, T. Higgins would be here for like the next 3 to 4 years, right? He just would. The extension would happen. The receiver market would fit to where they could keep Joe, Jamar, and T. T would have 1,300 yards this year and be one of the best receivers in the league, and you just keep rolling. The window, and we should keep this in mind as some of these draft picks get older, and hopefully they find the next T. Higgins at whatever position in some of these drafts, and their young guys emerge. Cam Taylor-Britt, maybe, if he has a great year this year, is the example. But last year was the year. Last offseason was the offseason that, to me, looking back, T and his camp should have had more urgency, and the Bengals should have had more urgency to get something done. There's a lot of second-round receivers, non-first-round receivers that have agreed to 3-year contracts. I think it would have made a ton of sense for everybody, and it didn't happen. And so now T's got to risk it and play on the franchise tag, doesn't have control next year, and may be tagged again. There's a possibility of that at least. And the Bengals obviously don't have T. Higgins under what would have ended up being a much more reasonable salary with the wide receiver boom. So last offseason, when I think about this saga, I don't really blame either side this year for not getting something done. Last year, though, I think the urgency or lack thereof on both sides is something that I would have changed if they gave me the power to go back and change it.
I like that you're both sidesing this one. I feel like this is a Bengals issue more than it's a T. Higgins and David Mulligetta issue. The Bengals can't seem to work with Mulligetta at this point, and I know it's only been 2 guys, but they've been 2 very notable pieces that I think going into their extension eligible windows for Jesse Bates and T. Higgins, we thought extensions would get done. The Bengals were not able to bridge the gap with the players' camp on either negotiation. They didn't even really get close with T. Higgins, according to what we knew last year. And you talk about urgency. It's an urgency thing. It's a player evaluation thing. It's a need to win the negotiation thing with this Bengals front office that we've seen play out with trying to keep some of their own guys, where they come to a number and a contract value for some of their own players or external free agents. This is both. It's not just their own guys, but if they don't get the numbers or close to the numbers they want, they're very content to say, okay, we'll do something else. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that works out. And honestly, we talked about this at some point in the offseason. Their decision to let players go or to keep players has often worked out, where some guys have gone on to not really do a whole lot after the Bengals have passed on extending them. The most recent example there is the Carl Lawson, Trey Hendrickson decision, or the valuation they had on Lawson not being as much as he got from the Jets. They pivoted quickly or had Trey Hendrickson there as their next plan or their alternative option. That worked out great for the Bengals, very notably. And that could happen with T. Higgins as well. I would say that the early returns are not positive for Jesse Bates, but in terms of reviewing the offseason and some of the takeaways, the one thing, or not the one thing, but one thing certainly that the Bengals have not yet modernized is getting first to market, doing things that the Eagles are doing in terms of being proactive with cap management and with getting ahead of everyone else on extensions, something that I think benefits the Eagles and could benefit the Bengals just from a management perspective.
Sure. Look, in the guaranteed dollars and all of that, no doubt, like you're just going to have to start swimming in those waters more. I think it's going to be hard not to with a lot of these young, talented players, assuming you continue to draft well and develop and all of those things. Mm-hmm. I will say, like, it's an educated statement. I'll say that. I'm not reporting it. But I do think that there should have been more urgency last year from Mulligetta. And the reason and he did this with Jesse too, and it worked out with Jesse because Jesse didn't get hurt. But you put your players at risk when you don't get deals done. And I don't think there was much negotiation last year. And that's been put out like it's just on the Bengals, and I don't think it is. Now, should you offer T, and I'm making up a number here, $15 million guaranteed on a 4-year deal, making up a number that is not reported? No, that's stupid. That's dumb. That would never get a deal done, right? Ever, never, ever. But, or 20 million or whatever, bad guarantees. It's not going to work. But I also think that Mulligetta is very, very comfortable with his guys playing on 1 year non-guaranteed long-term deals, and that's that's tough because you're trying to get the guaranteed money. I get it. But I like the 3 or 4 year deal. And so now he's going to have to go out there and show it. And if so, he'll get the deal. But you mentioned it, whether it's here or somewhere else, or maybe he'll get tagged again, like you mentioned. I'm sure we'll talk more about T. Higgins, but we have a whole offseason to react to. Plenty of new faces on the Bengals. We will continue our conversation coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is the app you need right now. NFL season's right around the corner. Baseball season is in full swing. And yes, the Reds have hit the All-Star break, but I'm sure you're going to try to sneak down there to Great American Ballpark a few times. Maybe you want to go see Luke Combs at Paycor Stadium in early August, or Thomas Rhett at Great American Ballpark in late August. Whatever live event you're looking to go to, whether it's a Bengals game this season, whether it's Reds, whether it's concerts, Gametime is the app you need. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. From Major League Baseball to concerts, they have last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and a lowest price guarantee that is going to make it worth your time. All you have to do is download the Gametime app and save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets. You can see the view from your seat. It's a panoramic view, so you know exactly what you're getting. And they have all-in prices, so you're not going to have to worry about hidden fees as you go to checkout. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
You're right, James. We have an entire offseason to recap and talk about some of the lessons learned, if any, or where we were accurate, where we were inaccurate about our projections, or where we disagree perhaps with what happened at certain junctions of the offseason. Now, T. Higgins was the first big move, the first notable move back in February. That was preceded technically by the extension of Devin Cochran, by future reserve contracts, by the termination of AJ McCarron's contract so he could go play football elsewhere. I don't think we need to get too in-depth on any of those. They also re-signed Cody Ford for 1 year. Drew Sample got his 3-year deal. Travion Williams signed a contract extension. All of this before free agency opened. And we got the first big news of the Bengals offseason after T. Higgins in March that the Bengals had agreed to terms with Geno Stone. I believe, James, this was the first free agent signing that we learned of with the Cincinnati Bengals back in that legal tampering window.
It was, and it was probably the most predicted one. I want to say, I mean, so many people thought, Geno Stone.
It was one of those things that was so predicted. I was like, there's no way this is happening because too many people are saying this is going to happen. You know?
No doubt. I felt the same way. And it's like, well, maybe not. And heck, it's exactly what happened. And look, I think a lot of these moves we're going to say that about a lot of what they did in free agency. And it's because we knew where their needs were and we knew what they were looking at. I mean, really down to a T. I mean, even the guys they brought in that they didn't sign, right? Mekhi Becton. We talked about Becton multiple times. T.R. Tart. We talked about him a bunch. And they go get Trent Brown. And so we'll get into all of these. But the Geno Stone thing, clearly they had a plan to overhaul the back end of that secondary. And the way they wanted to do that is pretty simple. Get a guy that can play that deep safety role. They felt like that's all they were missing. I think they would have been comfortable without adding Von Bell. But when Von Bell became available, it was like, all right, well, let's roll. And suddenly you have two guys in Geno Stone and Von Bell that are bringing a lot of experience and hopefully playmaking to that back end.
Yeah, you go back to setting the stage for free agency, what we expected the Bengals goals to be and how they went about achieving them. I remember calling it an extremely predictable free agency as it happened because we talked about the need for them to find a tight end, to remake the safety room. That was certainly something the Bengals signaled. Like you said, James, we expected the Bengals to move on from Joe Mixon. We discussed Zach Moss as a potential replacement. The Bengals then turn around and sign Zach Moss. They signed Mike Gesicki. We thought that the Bengals were unlikely to retain Chidobe Awuzie, to retain Jonah Williams, to retain Irv Smith Jr., and all of those players found homes elsewhere. Chidobe Awuzie going down to Tennessee to go with familiar face Brian Callahan, where Tyler Boyd also ends up. Jonah Williams just taking a starting offer from Arizona. But the first, I wouldn't call it a huge surprise, but perhaps mild surprise, because we thought the Bengals were prioritizing DJ Reader's return, was DJ Reader departing to the Detroit Lions, and then this big void being felt. And the reaction being, oh, well, they really need to replace that production now. How are they going to do that? There aren't any nose tackles out there. You mentioned Tier Tart, a guy the Bengals were interested in. We also knew they still needed to sign a tackle at this point as the official free agency period opened up. And the moves that they had made, while solid moves that we liked, Mike Gesicki, Zach Moss, Geno Stone, Von Bell, Tanner Hudson re-signed on March 15th as well. Like, these are all solid moves for the football team, where the tight end room suddenly has 3 players in it that are all competent NFL players. You have 2 safeties that have played at a solid starting level in the NFL. The running back changes to go more running back by committee with Zach Moss and the emergence of Chase Brown. This is all done at this point, but there's this huge need now to figure out, well, where are we going to see a starting right tackle? You can't go to the draft without a starting right tackle. And how are they going to replace the snaps, even if not the position, of DJ Reader? And those questions were answered pretty quickly once the official free agency period opened later that week.
Yeah. And leave it to the Bengals, right, to still do the visits. I mean,
how many reported visits do we hear about this offseason for any team in the NFL?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not a ton, right?
Yeah.
In the Bengals, it was easily 3. Now, Trent Brown's visit was like 8 hours. This dude got in late, came in the morning, said, yeah, I can block. And they said, whoop, sign. Well, they did the physical. He signed him. He's on a Zoom with us. It was pretty quick. But yeah, it's been a theme recently. And what was odd about this offseason, normally those guys just sign pretty close to right away. It's just happened. And that did not happen with Mekhi Becton and Tier Tart, and for whatever reason. And so the Bengals pivoted. And I would say this, if they had known, and I get it, there's some questions about Trent Brown's work ethic, all of those things, dedication. He's older. But Mekhi Becton had huge questions too. Like, if it was the same contract for both, and I'm sure it was similar, I would take Trent Brown. I don't know how you feel, but I would take Trent Brown, the more proven guy that when he's out there, we know what he's going to be.
I would take both, and they could have done both. I mean,
I would have taken both too. Yeah.
Mekhi Becton, I would have taken Tier Tart too, but I would say that from what we understand about that was a cultural fit thing more than anything else. Is the vibe around why that didn't come to fruition. But yeah, I would take both, especially because Mekhi Becton in Philly with Jeff Stoutland, one of the best offensive line coaches of all time, and certainly active in the NFL. He's working at guard, and sure, you would take Mekhi Becton to work at guard and to compete at tackle and all the things that you would expect him to do if he were on the team along with Trent Brown and Amarius Mims. And maybe then we wouldn't be talking about the interior offensive line depth, because at this point, I look back at our episodes around this time, 2 months ago or whatever it was, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, whenever this was. I'm scrolling back through our YouTube page here, looking at our videos. And after they signed Trent Brown, we're like, okay, are they going to sign a corner next? What's next? A 15,000 view YouTube video I'm looking at here, James. We thought they would sign a corner, and then we did some grades, and then we were like, are they done? Are they really done? We didn't think they were done. And then there were no more transactions.
They still shouldn't be done.
Well,
sign someone, damn it.
That's the thing, right? We still have to get through the draft, but there's this huge gap from March 19th when Trent Irwin re-signed and Trent Brown signed his contract officially, looking at the Bengals transaction log. Between then and the pre-draft deals for some depth players, Cal Adamitis signing his exclusive rights tag, Jake Browning signing his exclusive rights tag. They signed Logan Woodside for quarterback depth. They signed Joe Bacci. And then the draft hits. Let's discuss what happened in the draft, what holes that left, and why we still think they need to find another move to finish up the show coming up next.
Today's show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on social media, but in reality, they probably don't. And therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have so you can start living your best life. Whether it's getting things in order as well, when training camp starts, the school year is approaching too. It becomes a really hectic time for everyone in a bunch of facets of life. Well, therapy can help you prioritize exactly what you want. And BetterHelp is perfect for those that are on the go because it's going to fit your schedule. They have a flexible schedule that is pretty simple to get started, by the way. You just fill out a brief questionnaire. You get partnered with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time. And so whether you're traveling for work, whether you're working from home, whether you have to go in the office half the time, whether you have to travel to Canada, to see Jake Lisco, it doesn't matter. BetterHelp is going to fit your schedule. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
We get to the NFL draft, James, and continuing predictable things largely, and players
Largely.
that we,
Boom.
yeah, for a few picks really, players that we projected and called likely picks for the Cincinnati Bengals at some point in the pre-draft process, starting with Amarius Mims in the first round, Chris Jenkins in the second round, and then a shock in Jermaine Burton, not the wide receiver we thought they would pick in the third round, though we did expect a defensive tackle and a wide receiver to come to the Bengals on day two. Jermaine Burton was a guy that we overlooked because of reported character issues going into the draft that the Bengals certainly were comfortable with and has a potential future as wide receiver two with the Bengals, a lot of versatility that made sense in retrospect, but at the time, boy, that was a bit of a surprise. Then McKinley Jackson, a player that we knew the Bengals were interested in some way, shape, or form. We knew that they had done their homework on every single nose tackle in this draft class. The pick with the compensatory third round pick, a bit of a surprise for different reasons, just that it was maybe a round earlier than we thought, but as a compensatory third, you're right there on the third, fourth fringe anyway. But McKinley Jackson, depending on who you ask, was somewhere between a early day three to late day three prospect. The Bengals go that route a little bit earlier to make sure they get their nose tackle. But the beginning of this draft really went very much as we thought it would. And that even continued into day three to a large degree in broad strokes. But continuing the predictable offseason, the Bengals continued to do what we expected them to do.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean it's right or wrong. We'll see, TBD. But the logic is sound, and the logic makes sense. We knew they needed defensive tackle help. They got two guys that I think they're expecting to contribute right away, and a guy in Chris Jenkins that we mocked, Amarius Mims. Tea doesn't grow on trees. Neither do giants like Amarius Mims. And I think the Bengals going into that draft, they were like, all right, this is our chance. We don't plan on picking this early for a while. This is our chance in a deep tackle class to get a franchise tackle. And that's not to say that they didn't have other players on their board, but I think in an ideal world, they would have done exactly what they did. They went into the draft thinking offensive tackle, let's try to get one of these guys if they're there, and he was there. And so far, so good. So I think it fits. And part of why a lot of what we predicted or forecasted, and really a lot of people for this Bengals offseason, why it fits or matched up, and there was a lot of similarities in those predictions, is one, we have a better understanding of what this iteration of the Bengals, what they're doing, what they're targeting, all of those things. The other part is I just think fans, like they're smart. Fans are getting smarter. They're consuming as much as they can, and it's really easy to see how Geno Stone could fit, right? Or why Amarius Mims would fit with a 1-year veteran tackle like a Trent Brown, or insert whoever else you want to. But I don't want to gloss over this because Jermaine Burton was the shock of the draft. And I regretted it at the time because from a football standpoint, it makes sense. It's who we described that they were looking for. A versatile piece that could stretch the field, that can line up all over. That's who they think Jermaine Burton can be. And instead of instead of using a first rounder, which some would say wasting, or that second round pick on a wide receiver, they were able to wait until round 3 because of those character issues. And that's where they take advantage of it. We'll see if it pays off, but that was certainly the shock of the draft for me.
Yeah, I mean, that was Jalen McMillan all day.
Yeah. And I think he was next. I think he's a Bengal in a lot of scenarios. I do.
And he wasn't the only name that we thought might be in play there, but when that pick was coming up, it was like, okay, yeah, it's Jalen McMillan. That's who
I think it was
like
this, like Burton, and then McMillan was like, if Burton goes 79, they're like, okay, Jalen McMillan, you are a Bengal.
And I still recall wanting to put McKinley Jackson in that 3B, that compensatory pick.
You're never going to let me live that down.
Draft. And we didn't want to do it because we didn't think the Bengals would do it. But we were, the public, never saw it. But you and I were talking about before we did that episode, our predictive mock draft, putting McKinley Jackson at pick 97. And then we didn't end up, we went somewhere else. We didn't pull the trigger on that mock prediction. The Bengals rounded out the draft by picking a couple of tight ends. We knew they were doing a ton of homework on tight ends in this draft. They met with Eric Hall and Tanner McLaughlin before the draft. Dejan Anthony, another player that they brought in for an official visit early in the draft process, their 7th round pick. And this goes with Josh Newton, a corner depth, a guy that going into the season was seen as a day 1 or day 2 prospect, ends up falling with a up and down and uneven final collegiate season into day 3 of the draft. Cedric Johnson from Mississippi in the 6th round, and center of the future Matt Lee in the 7th round. And before the most recent move the Bengals made, which was extending Ted Karras in early June or mid-June, about a month ago, Matt Lee, center of the future, next year was that time horizon for Matt Lee. Now he has a couple of years, but rounding out the draft with the center, when we're wondering where are they going to pick an interior offensive lineman, we thought this was going to come where the McKinley Jackson pick was. But they wait all the way until the end of the draft with a guy that we think is a center-only prospect, a player that we really liked and we think has true starting upside as a very, very good pass protector in college. But what are your other thoughts there on day 3?
Yeah, I think the Eric Hall one, based on just how much they had expressed interest, I think it makes sense. It makes sense because this is really the first time, and you could say since Drew Sample, I think, but probably before that, where they think that they're getting a guy that's going to, and I guess Sample would be in that, but stabilize the tight end position. But the difference with All is I think they believe he has the upside to be an ideal fit in the passing game, as well as lining up in line and handling the blocking responsibilities and all of those things. So I think that's really intriguing. A weird theme that at least I've thought about. Last year, they take Andre Yosefach and Charlie Jones on day 3 in rounds 4 and 6. What was that class? It was considered a weak wide receiver class, relatively speaking, especially compared to recent years. This year, it's a tight end, just weak class compared to last year, where it was an awesome tight end class. They didn't get one. They take 2 tight ends in this year's class. It's just interesting. Will it pan out? I don't know. It's up to Andre, Charlie, Tanner, and obviously Eric. But it's just interesting strategy, certainly, by the Bengals. When you speak in generalities like that, they would say, all right, well, we like those prospects, of course.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to like. So hopefully they pan out.
It'll either be one of those things where we look back on this as the Bengals finding a market inefficiency in down years at the wide receiver and tight end position and finding some players on day 3 day 3, right?
Day 3.
Charlie Jones is late day 2. No, day 3. He was 4th.
Day 3. Yeah, 4th.
Okay. Confusing myself here. Finding some players on day 3 that can provide value, or we're going to look back on it and say the Bengals are reactionary and they missed these strong draft classes and then took swings the next year that didn't work out. Those are the two like extreme outcomes of that strategy and of that approach to those drafts at those positions for the Bengals. Like I said, the most recent news in the Bengals offseason, Ted Karras signing a contract extension for another year, stabilizing the center position while Matt Lee gets ready to take over that job whenever he's ready after the departure of Ted Karras eventually, which is likely something that will happen at some point. Maybe he signs another extension and retires a Bengal. Who knows? I guess we can't predict the future that far
Look
out.
at you just sleeping on Trey Hill now.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, is it sleeping on him after 3 years? Is that, can you be asleep after that? I don't know. Maybe. Impress me.
My
That would be awesome.
my tone might not have came through on audio. I think those on YouTube will understand what I was saying.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, I know. The other big story this offseason that we didn't really get into too much because we talked about it a ton all offseason was monitoring the health and rehabilitation of Joe Burrow and that wrist injury. And
We talked about Joe Burrow this offseason.
not in this episode, which was an offseason recap. And we talked about Joe Burrow a ton this offseason, which is why I bring it up now as we wrap up the show. We'll get into some training camp previews throughout the week, but if you missed anything this offseason or you're wondering what happened, how it happened, or just looking for an offseason reset and recap before we get to training camp and the official start to the 2024 preseason, hopefully this episode filled that gap for you. And until next time, we're back to 5 days a week this week, by the way. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.